Hello everyone, welcome back. Thank you for joining us. If you've just joined us or if you haven't been to stage one before, thank you. I'm delighted to welcome you to this session of the day, the future of artificial intelligence. And for it, we are joined by Dikai, who is obviously very well equipped to talk to us about that. He is one of 8 members selected by Google for its AI Ethics Council, Professor of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Science and Technology in Hong Kong, and a research scholar at Berkeley's International Computer Science Institute. He's among only 17 scientists worldwide named by the Association for Computational Linguistics as a Founding Fellow for his pioneering contributions to machine translation and machine learning foundations of systems like Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft translators. In 2015, he was recognized by Debrett's Hong Kong as one of the 100 most influential figures of Hong Kong. So, Dikai, thank you very much indeed for joining us at what is not the most sociable hour for you. Thank you.
Happy to be here. You are an artificial intelligence. Okay, I'm hearing you. What are you talking about? But consider the Oxford definition of artificial. Made or produced by human beings rather than occurring naturally, and typically as a copy of something natural. I think we can agree that you wouldn't have just occurred naturally without having been made by human beings as a rough copy of something natural, your parents. And since we agree you're intelligent, you're an artificial intelligence. Okay, remember that when we ask today's question, what is the future of AI? Well, it depends on what AI means. These days, the term AI seems to be used everywhere, or perhaps I should say misused, because so often people don't even seem to understand what AI means. How often have you heard that AI can't do this or that AI may now be massively powerful, but will still forever be unable to do certain uniquely human things like emotion or creativity or empathy? I even had somebody insisting to me that AI meant exactly the same thing as machine learning and deep learning. Now look, machine learning and deep learning are just the latest wave of models in the century-long history of the field of AI. It's a history that has witnessed alternating cycles of hyped breakthroughs and then quiet retrenchments, just like in any other discipline. Personally, this is already my 3rd AI hype cycle in just my 37 years in the field of AI. AI is a discipline, a field of inquiry that investigates how intelligence can be modeled. Like the discipline of physics, a field of inquiry that investigates how the physical world can be modeled. And even though my PhD was one of the first theses to propose probabilistic machine learning approaches to natural language interpretation, AI is not defined as machine learning or deep learning or any particular computing model, just like the discipline of physics is not defined as Newtonian or relativity or quantum physics or any other competing model. And as our AI models get closer and closer to human intelligence in capability and or architecture, if we eventually build a brain in a body whose form and function is sufficiently close to humans, then that artificial intelligence will be very much like the one your parents unwittingly made. So, what is the future of artificial intelligence? That goes far beyond the narrow questions we typically ask about today's weak AI. Let me break it down into 3 parts: learning capacity, emotional intelligence, and social intelligence. All 3 of these questions about the future of AI revolve around the crucial notion of bias. Now, bias is yet another one of the terms that gets used confusingly in many different ways. I'm going to break down 3 completely different kinds of bias that, with respect to the 3 questions we just laid out about the future of AI, turn out to all be equally crucial. And these are inductive bias, unconscious bias, and algorithmic bias. First up, the key to the learning capacity of future AIs is the first kind of bias, inductive bias. How will future AIs learn? Today's AIs do some impressive tricks, but they're actually mostly just regurgitating whatever they memorized. And that's why the commercial AIs you're using daily require such gargantuan amounts of data to train, typically on the order of trillions of words to train a translation or voice recognition system. Compare that to 3-year-old humans who typically master their mother tongue, having had only 12 million words spoken to them. That is tiny in comparison. It's roughly the square root of the amount of data that current data guzzling deep learning AIs require. And to train AIs on that huge, exponentially huge amount of data, something like GPT-3 costs between $10 and $15 million just for a single training run. You know, real AI is not big data. Real AI is small data. The learning capacity of future AIs will be that human ability to learn from the same small data that 3-year-olds do. So the next time you hear that data is the new oil, remember, that's only because the currently hyped AI models are gas guzzlers. But the future AIs will be Teslas. Now, how are we going to get there? Well, the key is a fundamental mathematical concept called inductive bias. In any machine learning process, or for that matter, any human learning process, it is mathematically impossible to learn any generalization without having some kind of inductive bias. Because without an inductive bias, the most that you can do is to just memorize the training data. It's like those classmates you had who crammed at the last minute before the exam. They can't generalize what they've seen to new, previously unseen cases. And that's because generalization requires a leap of faith that after flipping a coin 10 times in a row and seeing only heads, thinking it's not only, that lightning has struck or you've won the lottery. Rather, you jump to the conclusion that the coin is a trick coin that's been unfairly weighted. But to make that kind of leap of faith, you need a bias. How skeptical are you? Is 10 times in a row enough? Or do you need to see 50 heads in a row or 1,000 heads in a row? Mathematically, we say that there are two kinds of inductive bias. There's a search bias and a language bias, which comes by many names like model bias, representation bias, restriction biases, and so on. Point is, a language bias places a restriction on what parts of the space of hypotheses are allowed to be entertained. Now it's kind of abstract. So in ordinary daily life, we run into language bias every day. Many of you have probably heard of the linguistic relativity phenomenon described by the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It's often summarized by the phrase, language structures thought. The languages that you know strongly promote what types of thoughts you're likely to think. And conversely, the languages you don't know strongly suppress what types of thoughts you're not likely to think. And there's a long record of empirical evidence that having the right strong language bias is crucial to being able to leap to the right generalizations after seeing only a small amount of data. Our own work introduced some strong empirically validated language biases that made possible the kind of Google Translate AIs that we pioneered. And the future of AI's ability to learn efficiently will be further breakthroughs in discoveries about language biases. Turning to the second question, the key to the emotional intelligence of future AIs is the second kind of bias, unconscious bias. What will be the emotional makeup of future AIs? You've all seen the cliche propagated by Hollywood characters like Mr. Data or the Terminator, that AIs are logical and rational and emotionless. It's based on outdated ideas about AI as being primarily logic-based and rule-based, which was 2 hype cycles ago in the 1970s and 1980s. Today's modern machine learning-based AI is anything but logical or rule-based. Logic and rule-based AI, sometimes now called good old-fashioned AI, attempted to model the part of our mental processing that is conscious, controlled processing. These mental reasoning processes are relatively slow, requiring a lot of training, effort, intention, and attention. And they depend heavily on our linguistic abilities so that we can think by talking to ourselves internally. Danny Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow calls this System 2. Examples of mental tasks requiring controlled processing include playing chess or Go, planning logistics, doing algebra. Now back then, AI researchers had this mistaken idea that since these tasks are hard for humans, then if a machine could outperform humans, the AI problem would be solved. And So they focus decades of effort trying to program computers to mimic how we think about things. Of course, sadly, this turned out not to be true. Machines are already far better at chess, logistics, and algebra than humans are, but they still stumble laughably on simple language understanding tasks that even 3-year-olds have no trouble with. Because the kind of mental processing that 3-year-olds use to learn and understand language is what Kahneman calls System 1, unconscious automatic processing. And that's true for adults as well. As you interpret what I'm saying, you're not thinking, oh, interpret, that was a verb, and you was a pronoun referring to the agent doing the interpreting, etc. You'd be here until next year if you had to do that just to listen to my 20-minute talk. The overwhelming majority of our mental processes operate under the radar. We're not consciously aware of them. These automatic processes are fast, they require relatively little effort or attention, and typically are unintentional. We have trouble even verbalizing most of these processes. And the advances leading to today's new AI hype cycle, deep learning, artificial neural networks, machine learning, these are models of this kind of unconscious automatic processing. Instead of modeling how we think about things, they model how we feel about things. Because automatic processing is unconscious, we humans have all kinds of unconscious biases. These biases were valuable evolutionarily because overreacting saved our prehistoric ancestors more than underreacting hurt them. The way that we feel about something connects deeply to underlying fears, hopes, loves, hates. Emotions are unconscious indicators of underlying aims and desires. Future AIs, building on all of today's advances in modeling of how we feel about something, will naturally incorporate unconscious indicators of aims and desires, that is, emotion. And contrary to the Hollywood popular cliches, emotions are actually easier to model in AIs than human-level intelligence. Emotions don't require the complexities of human cognition. Anyone who has a dog or even a pet mouse can attest to their very full range of emotions. Future AIs will be just as good as humans at how they feel about something. Let's turn to the third question. The key to the social intelligence of future AIs is the third kind of bias, namely algorithmic bias. How will future AIs be shaped by society, and how will they shape society? Now, some of you have probably heard of algorithmic bias in the context of the fact that machine learning picks up the same biases contained in the social data that we train AIs upon. But it's important to recognize that our own human brains are also running algorithms. We are all artificial intelligences who pick up the same biases as in the social data around us, both in the physical world and online. And the feedback loop between AIs and humans' algorithmic biases is growing exponentially. The AI algorithms that power advertising-based news and social media and search and recommendation engines continue to generate enormous profits, profiting by exploiting us humans' built-in unconscious biases, cognitive biases, the ones that evolution hardwired into us. Whether it's the overconfidence effect, pseudo-certainty effect, ambiguity effect, Dunning-Kruger effect, bias blind spot, advertising profit is maximized when AIs prey upon our unconscious. And so misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation are running rampant. Our civilization, our planetary group of humans, have been joined by AIs who are exponentially amplifying our unconscious groupthink bias. The AIs are encouraging disastrous government responses, especially in democracies. Look at what has been happening with COVID. Love in the time of coronavirus is scarce, replaced by irrationality, fear, and hatred. The AIs are amplifying disastrous mass behavior, false senses of security early on, and then panic buying, and then ineffective preventative measures. The AIs are driving disastrous polarization, both unintentionally as well as via political abuse, amplifying conspiracy theories and racism. The AIs are algorithmically learning the same human unconscious biases that are our own Achilles heel, all in the name of profit. We've seen AIs promoting disastrous mistakes like believing the coronavirus would remain an Asian problem so the West need not worry too much. Because social media amplified our representativeness heuristic to make wrong predictions from experience of similar events like SARS, MERS, or Ebola without realizing that we were overestimating its ability to predict accurately. And social media fed our present bias, focusing us on immediate payoffs instead of thinking about future trade-offs. AIs have driven polarization and hatred with memes like Chinese eat bats causing COVID. Chinese don't actually eat bats. Some wild game likely transmitted the bat virus, and oh, by the way, wild game is widely eaten in most of the world. But profit-seeking AIs learned to exploit our confirmation bias, and combined with affinity bias, which biases us toward people like ourselves, and selective perception, where our expectations drive perception. Social media drove polarization and hatred by spreading the Chinese virus meme. AI preys upon our empathy gap. We don't call the H1N1 swine flu the American virus, even though the CDC says that's where it started. It kicks in our defensive attribution bias to blame someone else as the outcome becomes more severe. AI is amplifying framing bias, which misleads us to conclusions based on how a situation or issue is narrowly or metaphorically described. It's leaning in on the reiteration effect, making us believe things via repeated exposure so that familiarity overpowers rationality. Politicians abuse information weaponization to deflect blame. Scientists long established that it's not an escaped bioweapon from anybody, but politicians can abuse AI to amplify hostile attribution bias, making us unconsciously interpret others' behavior as having hostile intent. They get AI to feed our belief bias so that we'll rationalize their conspiracy theories biased by a priori beliefs. Thanks to our continued influence effect, we'll believe previously learned misinformation even after corrections. So misinformation still continues to influence our inferences. And even worse, AI makes huge profits off of the backfire effect, feeding our unconscious desire when confronted with counter evidence just to double down and strengthen our incorrect beliefs even more. AI propagated misinformation hurts mass behavior. Early in the pandemic, AI learned to propagate the belief that you should sip a hot drink every 15 minutes to wash the virus down and let stomach acids kill it. Sure, staying hydrated is good, but that doesn't kill the virus. Colbert called this truthiness. The illusory truth effect makes us believe falsehoods that are easier to process. The same effect propagated disastrous misinformation that masks are mainly for protecting yourself, when in fact, everyone should wear masks to stop their own droplets that come from coughing, sneezing, or talking from infecting others. Masks are mainly to protect your fellow community. So why were AIs learning to propagate the idea that masks were unnecessary? Well, they were feeding our reactance, which makes us resist constraints on our freedom of choice. The fact that successful universal mask wearing strategies were all in Asia, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, etc., fed our reactive devaluation bias, where we devalue proposals only because they originated with a perceived adversary. It fed our not invented here bias because this approach was developed outside our own group. I truly hope the future of AI is not to keep letting AIs be driven by profit-seeking algorithmic biases that propagate memes leading to disastrous mass behavior, even in the face of global or existential challenges like pandemics or climate change. We simply can't afford it. For the sake of humanity, the future of AI must be empathetic AIs that aim to mindfully overcome the unconscious training of our harmful algorithmic biases. Otherwise, we'll be calling into question not the future of AIs, but rather the future of humankind. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's absolutely fascinating to hear all of that from you. And can I invite the audience to please do type your questions into the box on the side of your screen. As I say, then you might be able to see something there that suggests there aren't any questions, but please feel very free to type them away. Just while we're waiting, I would ask, you say we're all full of individual biases, which is more and more, sometimes more apparent, or perhaps we're noticing it more and more, with progress. But how exactly do you ensure that our already biased world does not move into the AI space then?
I think the issue is that it's a cycle. It's a feedback cycle. So the unconscious biases that humanity carries are the training data for the AI machine learning. We are the training data. And so AIs will pick up, this is the point of algorithmic biases, AIs will pick up whatever bias is in the training data, which is us. And then the problem is, because of recommendation engines and search engines and social media engines, which are all driven by these AIs, they will then take those algorithmic biases that we are teaching them and feed them back in. And so, while we've always had this problem in human society, this is now like putting an exponential megaphone on that process. Mm. And so we end up facing a situation that humanity has never had to face before. And the old checks and balances that we evolved over millennia of developing civilization are suddenly nowhere near enough to keep up with that exponential amplification of the problem.
Fascinating. Somebody asks, how can we as individuals help teach AI empathy then?
I have been trying to get people to think of AIs differently than sort of we have this tendency to think of AIs the same way we think about computers and before that, automobiles and any other kind of machines we've invented. We think of them as somehow our passive mechanical tools. They're slaves. But the problem is that these are not just machines in that classic sense. These machines are not automating muscle and labor the way machines used to do. These machines are automating thought, and they are influencing society. In fact, they are reflecting what algorithmic biases we teach them back into society more than most humans are influencing society. So everything changes when you're automating opinion and the influence on other people's opinions. We really need to look at these new AIs not as passive mechanical tools. We need to think of them as artificial children, because that's what they are. They do the same thing that human children do. They learn from observing our behavior, from the rewards and punishments that we give them. And then they go and they propagate that through society. And the question that I often ask people, given that all of us are raising AIs because we're all carrying these things, and they're observing us and they're learning their algorithmic biases from us. Well, how's your parenting? How well are you parenting your artificial children?
I think we've got time for the very quickest. I'm going to ask you just 1 minute answer, but does your vision believe that humans will stay in control of AI?
I think that the question is framed in a misleading way. That question is framed in terms of, a standard Hollywood and fairy tale metaphor, somehow between black and white, two parties. It's adversarial. What is happening today is that AIs are actually merging with human intelligences. Even with today's weak AI, this thing over here, my brain is already being augmented by this brain here. I have terrible spatial orientation, but Google Maps is augmenting my brain, and I used to be able to remember phone numbers. I can't do that anymore because it's all downloaded into this. And this is even, just wait until we have the smart glasses where it's in your field of vision all the time, and then on the way to contact lenses, and finally embedding in the brain. Our intelligences are blurring already today. Our brains have rewired themselves to use these AIs as part of the brain. So the question isn't so much whether we will remain in control of the AIs. It's whether the jointly merged human and artificial intelligences will remain in charge of a stable society.
Thank you very much indeed. It neatly ends on time. Thank you. It's been fascinating hearing from you, and thank you all very much for tuning in and joining us, signing in. Thank you.